But first, the platypus. The first European to describe it called it a small amphibian of the mole kind. It baffled the finest scientific minds of Europe, and to say it totally upset the prevailing theories of evolution and classification is something of an understatement. Indeed, the arrival in Europe of the first specimen ignited a passionate scientific debate in which reputations were made or sundered over such thorny questions as whether the animal was mammal, bird or reptile, and whether or not it laid eggs. Now, the platypus played an important part in Charlie Darwin's theory of evolution, and it helped shape the course of Australian biology. To discuss the platypus, I was joined by Anne Moyle, an historian of Australian science and the author of Platypus, The Extraordinary Story of How a Curious Creature Baffled the World. And I began by asking Anne about the immense kerfuffle the discovery of the creature, along with other odd flora and fauna, caused in learned circles in Europe.
Well, I don't think any other learned flora and fauna caused such a stir. The first specimens of the platypus, as you pointed out, arrived at about 1799, and it was examined by George Shaw, who was the great the author of Naturalist Miscellany, and he looked at it gravely and thought, of course, was this a colonial hoax with its beak side, its bill tied on or sewn on to a furred body and its webbed feet and so forth. But after a discerning view of it, he had decided it was sui generis. In other words, it was quite unique. But it flung itself, the poor little animal, up against the whole classificatory system that the great minds were dealing with in Europe and in Britain, and therefore he pronounced it the paradoxical platypus. He called it the platypus, but it was later discovered shortly after that there was a beetle that had the generic specific of platypus, and so the name had to be dished, but no one's taken much notice of that, and we all know it as the platypus.
I like Governor John Hunter suggesting that the platypus comes about through the promiscuous intercourse of various kinds of animals.
Well, no, this wasn't. Yes, it was Hunter that certainly, and the Governor Hunter, who was a very acute-eyed naturalist, but he liked that idea, and it flowed into the writings of Erasmus Darwin, so it had quite a currency. But the platypus was the most bizarre of all Australian animals. But even the kangaroo had begun to expose the whole weakness in many of the taxonomic concepts in Britain and Europe, and people and their star players, the key scientists, fought very hard for their particular interpretations of the platypus.
I'm going to introduce the wombat for just a second, because for reasons that I'm sure you can anticipate, I want to tell the listener that the original model for Lewis Carroll's Dormouse in the Mad Hatter scene in Alice in Wonderland was a wombat. But he kept having to explain the wombat to people and say, change it to a dormouse. Why am I raising the wombat issue? Well, because of this, the platypus and the wombat arrive in Europe in a barrel of spirits, don't they? And they get sploshed all over the floor.
So the story goes. It was said by Hunter that the wombat was preserved. The platypus was a dried specimen, whereas the wombat was in spirits. But they were collected by some poor unsuspecting servant woman at Newcastle on Tyne, and to be carried up to the museum there. And the cask apparently, which she carried on her head, splattered and broke. And there at her feet, she swooned away as when she saw this extraordinary animal with a beak and fur and so forth. So the story goes. I don't know how true it is.
Well, let's keep the story going. I like stories like that. Now, you mentioned the possibility that it was a hoax. To put that into context, the Chinese had been creating hoax creatures, hadn't they, for the market?
Yes, the Chinese and apparently Japanese taxidermists had a tendency to stitch a monkey's head onto a fish's tail, and so the arrival of this little animal, the quaint platypus in England, immediately raised the suspicion that these cheeky colonialists were playing a joke on their grave English mentors. But not so, as it proved. That idea had to be abandoned, and then, of course, they all set to secure specimens, dried specimens from Australia to dissect them. Joseph Banks, of course, got into the act, and it was very hard on the European scientists because they had much more difficulty getting hold of specimens than the English did through Joseph Banks' connections.
Well, given all the strange northern hemispherical speculations or fantasies about what might be going on in the Antipodes, people walking around on their heads and so on, the platypus was the perfect expression, wasn't it, of hemispherical paradox?
Well, absolutely, because the patronising Brits, as we have to see they can be, took the view that Australia, with its highly anomalous sets of animals, including the kangaroo and your wombat and so forth, that it was a sort of faunal, a sort of zoological penal colony, that we had the convicts there and everything was upside down and contrary, and that it was a sort of faunal gulag. And these attitudes didn't help in solving the riddle of what was the question of questions with the platypus, is how it produced its young. And though it was a mix of, as you said in your introduction, possibly a mammal, a reptile and a bird, it had early been established by people like Linnaeus and even Aristotle that the way you classified animals was quite principally on their reproductive organs. And the little platypus was genitally, if I can put it that way, very peculiar, and that's because, as most of us know or don't know, it has one chamber, or it's a one-holer. Therefore, it sends forth its young through the same channel as its excretionary function, and this makes it. That's why it was subsequently called a monotreme. But this made it very weird indeed, and this and the question as to whether it had glands to suckle its young, whether it had mammae, were the central questions of questions as to what sort of animal it was and where it should be classified.
I'd read in a biography of Napoleon years and years ago that there was a kangaroo bounding around Malmaison, where, of course, Napoleon and Josephine were trying to create the modern rose. But I didn't realise, until I read your book, that Josephine, in fact, had an entire Australian menagerie there.
Yes, the wonderful French expedition under Nicholas Bowden to Australia in about 1802-4, which carried Perron and a very great artist, Charles Le Sueur, they had brought back on the two ships in that expedition, they took back some live cargo. In fact, the live cargo eventually displaced the officers on the ships, much to their annoyance, and these animals fetched up with Josephine at Malmaison. I don't know that Napoleon was around much at that point, but she certainly cultivated the whole Australian flora. She had flora growing there and fauna, and even her great double bed had a black swan etched on it. So she was deeply into it.
Is that right? Now, I recognise that this the gathering process was as you describe it, but my biography of Napoleon had it as Joseph Banks donating the kangaroo. Was this possible?
I think there are a few apocryphal stories about that, because he's supposed at the height of war to have sent a specimen of the platypus to Napoleon. It was rather, sort of competitive efforts. Everything was extremely, all of the wrangling that went on over the platypus and its very queer affinities was very strong between the French and the English, even when the war was over.
But he did say science is never at war, didn't he? Joseph
yes, that's very true, he did. And in some ways it wasn't that he supposedly sent a platypus, but that's very difficult to authenticate at this stage. There are many myths and legends, Philip.
You're listening to Late Night Live on Radio National, and I'm talking to that fascinating creature, Anne Moyle, about the platypus. Now, the platypus was originally judged to be a mammal. Why they didn't think it was possibly a fish puzzles me a little, but no one knew for many years how it reproduced. How was that matter resolved? This idea of the of the omni-channel.
It took nearly 90 years from the moment the animal first arrived in England, and for the first 30 years there were many battles between the scientists like Cuvier and Lamarck and Richard Owen in London. He was a very key figure in this, and Sir Everard Home and so forth. And it wasn't until the 30s that Richard Owen really confirmed that it was a mammal and that it had mammae. And after that, there was a heavy dependence on what people could send from the colonies. There was a splendid naturalist out here, a British naturalist, who came to settle in Australia called Dr. George Bennett, who was a physician. And he, poor man, spent 50 years in time off from his duties as a doctor, scouring the platypus burrows and trying to find some evidence as to whether the animal laid eggs or, as Richard Owen supposed, was like a reptile and a shark. It produced its young from eggs within the body. And this notion of being ovoviviparous, which is the meaning of that, took very firm hold, and it was very detrimental to science and to the solution of this great biological question, because in the end it was not Bennett and all the carnage and thousands of specimens of the platypus in utero that he sent to Owen to dissect that solved the riddle. It was a young Scottish postgraduate student who'd studied in Cambridge, who came out for a period of study, camped on the Burnett River in southern Queensland, and aided, I may say, by 50 Aborigines who were there, collected an enormous number of these poor platypuses, and in one he found a female who had just laid an egg and had another egg dilated in her uterus. And so he knew that the animal laid egg, and I'm very glad to say, as historian of telecommunications, he rushed to a local telegraph station, very small, near the Burnett River, and got the news out.
Did the curiosity, focusing on these little critters, endanger them to any sense? Was there an enormous amount of platypus collecting, capturing, cropping?
Well, there certainly was. And there wasn't a great interest in the work in Australia, I have to say. Zoology rather lagged behind botany in the colonies in the 19th century. But Bennett was the spearhead of the collecting of this, and then he put his son onto it. So their carnage was pretty real, but certainly that it had no relationship to the carnage of this young man from Scotland called William Caldwell, who was good enough in the end to admit that without the help of the Aborigines, he could never have solved the problem. And this was particularly important, Philip, because throughout the 19th century, the Aborigines who were consulted by Bennett were murmured about the animal laying eggs, but of course no one took any notice of them. So they were very important in the end.
They're not on the endangered list now, are they? They're pretty good survivors.
No, they're the greatest survivors in a sense, both in an evolutionary sense, because they are now regarded by contemporary biologists and monotremes specialists as the most evolved animal in the animal kingdom.
In what sense?
In the sense that they have this electric beak, and it's only research in the last 10 years or so, and particularly at Monash University and a little at the ANU, that has revealed that the great shield that separates the platypus's beak from its head, and which the early naturalists thought was a fraud and thought it was the stitched part, that they have a whole set of electric nerve endings there, which enables them to have an electrolocation of their food. You see, when they dive, and they're voracious eaters, they eat about half their weight every day. They dive.
Of what, Anne? I've got to ask.
Of shrimps. They're carnivores, let's face it. And they have a tremendously diverse menu, which means they have to cover great areas to get it every day. But they do it by they dive in, they close their eyes and their ears, and it's their electric sense from the bill that takes them from quite a distance to the food. And so this is a unique sensory evolutionary development, which is quite unlike any other animal. And it's extremely sophisticated. So far from being a faunal gulag, as people like to think, and far from having what 19th century scientists always referred to as a very primitive animal, it turns out to have been the great survivor, the survivor of the strangest, as it were, rather than the fittest.
Well, I know we've got quite a lot around our place, but in 15 years, I've only seen about a dozen, and you go looking and looking and looking. They're hard to spot.
Oh, they're hard as hell to spot. I've hardly spotted any, and I've spent a couple of years, absolutely geared to the little creatures, and this is very irritating. But you see, I think they know I'm at it, and but they also, this is why it took really such a very long time, 85 years, to discover their secret. They built these very deep labyrinthine burrows with false leads off, and so they have a nesting chamber, which is very hard to get to. And you can see why Paul Bennett struggled for 50 years.
Well, I've always wondered how they survive massive floods. Sometimes the river comes up and it's up for a week or so, knocks bridges down, all the rest of it. Yet they survive. So the burrows must be extensive and come up somewhere above even flood level.
Well, they plug their burrows so that they're really self-contained. But it's a curious thing that you should say that, because in the Aboriginal legends about the platypus, and Nuniapan, who was once on our one of our notes, he wrote about the fact how this legend reveals the fact that the animals felt there were too many platypuses about, but then they thought the great floods would get rid of them, and had. But then they realised that this unique animal must always be part of their dreaming. So the floods were very much part of Aboriginal knowledge about the platypuses.
Do we know all there is to know about these fascinating little fellas?
Oh, no, far from it. There's a tremendous amount of research yet to be done. People don't yet know how far they travel and what impact they have on the ecology. I think there's work being done by a young woman at Sydney University at the moment. Because they eat so much, I believe, it's now thought that they have quite a substantial effect on their immediate ecology because they consume so many insects, shrimps and the like. And so there's still a great deal to be done, and though they're not on an endangered list,
they are protected, aren't they?
Yeah, they are protected, and they have to be conserved. They get caught in wires and things and all, and so there we go.
That was Anne Moyle, historian of Australian science and founder and past president of the Independent Scholars Association of Australia, a group she launched on this very program. And Anne's book, Platypus, The Extraordinary Story of How a Curious Creature Baffled the World, is published by Allen and Unwin. Classic LNL, ABC Radio National.